I stood there in my cream-colored dress, surrounded by flickering candles and the expectant faces of our closest friends and family. The small chapel we'd chosen for our 40th wedding anniversary, vow renewal, was perfect. Intimate, warm, filled with 4 decades worth of memories and love. Or so I thought. The antique clock on the wall ticked past 2:30 p.m., then 2:45, then 3 hours. Each minute stretched longer than the last, each tick of the clock echoing through the sacred space like a hammer striking against my heart. Daniel wasn't coming. I kept smoothing down my dress, the one I'd carefully selected weeks ago. It had seemed so important then, finding just the right shade, the right fit, the right style to mark this milestone. Now, the fabric felt like it was suffocating me, each thread woven with 40 years of misplaced trust. "Maybe there's been an accident," my daughter Sarah whispered, her hand squeezing mine. She was trying to help, but I could see the truth dawning in her eyes too. The same truth I'd been fighting to ignore for weeks. The subtle signs, the late nights at work, the way his phone would go silent whenever I entered the room. I watched our guests shift uncomfortably in their seats, witnessed their pitying glances and hushed conversations. The flowers I'd chosen, white roses and baby's breath, seemed to wilt before my eyes, as if they too understood the magnitude of this betrayal. My phone lay silent in my clutch. No calls, no texts, no explanations. Just silence. The kind that screams louder than any words could. I didn't cry. Not then. Instead, I did what I'd perfected over 40 years of marriage. I smiled. It was a small, dignified smile that revealed nothing of the earthquake happening beneath my surface. "I think we should all go home," I announced, my voice steady despite the tremors in my soul. Clearly, there's been a misunderstanding. As our guests filed out, offering awkward hugs and well-meaning platitudes, I remained standing by the altar. This place where we were supposed to reaffirm our love had become a monument to its end instead. The irony wasn't lost on me. How fitting that the death of our marriage should occur in the very spot where we'd planned to breathe new life into it. Later that evening, as I sat alone in our kitchen with its familiar scents and sounds, its drawers full of shared memories and tangled lives, the truth arrived in the form of a text message. Not from Daniel, but from my friend, Patricia. "I'm so sorry, Marianne. I just saw them together at the airport. Daniel and someone else, a younger woman. They were heading to Paris." The phone slipped from my fingers, clattering against the marble countertop we'd picked out together 15 years ago. Paris, our Paris, the city where we'd spent our honeymoon, where we'd promised forever under stars that seemed so much brighter then. I didn't scream. I didn't break things. Instead, I poured myself a glass of the wine we'd been saving for today's celebration, and I began to think, really think. Because while Daniel might have orchestrated this day's performance, he had no idea that he'd just opened the curtain on an entirely different show, one where I would finally play the leading role. The morning after the failed vow renewal ceremony, I woke up in our king-sized bed, my hand automatically reaching for Daniel's side, a habit formed over 4 decades. The sheets were cold, untouched, just like they'd been for the past few weeks. Now I understood why. Looking around our bedroom, I saw our life together in every corner. The antique dresser we'd found at that little shop in Vermont during our 20th anniversary trip. The collection of small ceramic birds on the windowsill, one for each year of our marriage, each containing a tiny note about our hopes for the future. The wedding photo on the wall, showing 2 young people who believed in forever. I was 19 when I met Daniel, fresh out of high school, working as a receptionist at his father's law firm, Dreams of college temporarily set aside to help support my ailing mother. He was 26, already an associate attorney, with a confidence that made the world seem less daunting. I still remember how he would bring me coffee every morning, always remembering the exact amount of cream I liked. It was the little things that made me fall in love with him. When we married, I thought I was living a fairy tale. Daniel encouraged me to go back to school, supported my dreams of becoming a teacher, but somehow, over the years, those dreams got lost in the shuffle of raising our children, maintaining our home, being the perfect wife for an increasingly successful lawyer. I became so good at being Mrs. Daniel Harrison that I almost forgot who Marianne Sullivan had been. Our children, Sarah and Michael, grew up in this house. I can still see Sarah taking her first steps across this very room, Michael practicing his graduation speech in front of the full-length mirror. I was always here, always present, always making sure everything ran smoothly. While Daniel built his career, I built our home. The morning coffee ritual gradually disappeared. The ceramic birds stopped appearing on my birthday. The little notes he used to leave in my purse became a thing of the past. But I told myself this was normal, that this was what happened in long-term marriages. We were comfortable, secure. Wasn't that enough? Standing at our bedroom window now, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, I realized how many sunrises I'd watched alone, how many times I'd made excuses for his absences, his distraction, his growing distance. I'd become an expert at filling silences with explanations that protected his image, both in my mind and in others' eyes. My mother used to say, "A woman knows her worth by what she accepts." For 40 years, I accepted less and less, convincing myself it was a sign of maturity, of understanding, of love. But as I stood there, watching another day begin, I finally understood what my mother had really meant. It wasn't about accepting less. It was about recognizing when you've accepted too little for too long. I picked up one of the ceramic birds, the one from our 30th anniversary. Inside was a note in my handwriting. "Here's to 10 more years of growing together." I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. We hadn't been growing together at all. While I was tending to our shared life like a careful gardener, Daniel had been planting seeds in another garden entirely. Her name was Brittany Lawrence. I learned this on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after the vow renewal ceremony that never happened. She was 38, 20 years my junior, and worked as an interior designer. The kind of woman who posted carefully curated photos of minimalist rooms and coffee art on Instagram. I found myself scrolling through her profile, each swipe of my finger revealing another piece of the life she'd been building with my husband. There they were, in a photo from 3 months ago, at a restaurant I didn't recognize. Daniel was wearing the blue sweater I'd given him for Christmas. His smile, that smile I thought I knew every version of, looked different somehow. Younger, more alive. The caption read, "Business dinner with the brilliant Daniel Harrison. Our new projects." Joshua excited. New projects indeed. I didn't delete the photos I found of them together. Instead, I saved them all, creating a folder on my computer titled Evidence, not for divorce proceedings, though that would come later, but for myself. Because every time I felt the urge to doubt my sanity, to question whether I was overreacting, these photos served as anchors to reality. The worst part wasn't discovering their relationship. It was realizing how long it had been happening right under my nose. That business trip to Chicago last spring. They were actually in Aspen. The late-night meetings, dinner dates at exclusive restaurants across town. Even the renovations he'd been suggesting for our house. They weren't his ideas at all. They were hers. Sarah, our daughter, was the one who finally told me the full truth. She'd known for weeks but hadn't known how to tell me. "Mom," she said, her voice cracking over the phone. "They're planning to live here, in our house. Dad's been having Brittany draw up renovation plans for months." I sat in my garden, among the roses I'd tenderly grown for decades, as Sarah continued. Apparently, Daniel and Brittany had already picked out new furniture, chosen paint colors, planned to tear down walls. They were going to erase every trace of my existence, transform my sanctuary into their fresh start. The peculiar thing about betrayal is how it forces you to become an archaeologist of your own life. I began excavating memories, re-examining moments I'd dismissed, the mysterious credit card charges, the sudden interest in modern art, the new cologne he'd started wearing. Each discovery was another shard of my shattered reality, but I collected them all carefully, methodically. That evening I made dinner as usual, chicken piccata, Daniel's favorite. He came home late, as he had been doing for months. I watched him eat, watched him compliment the meal with the same practiced politeness he'd used for years. I wondered if he'd already eaten somewhere else, with her. I wondered if she cooked for him, if she knew about his shellfish allergy, if she'd memorized the exact way he liked his coffee in the morning. "The house needs updating," he said casually between bites, not meeting my eyes. "I've been thinking about having some work done. Nothing major, just modernizing a few things." I nodded, smiled even. "That sounds nice," I replied, my voice steady. "The house could use a woman's touch." He looked up sharply, searching my face for any hidden meaning. But I'd had 40 years of practice at wearing this mask of peaceful contentment. He saw exactly what I wanted him to see. A compliant wife, still blind to his betrayal. Little did he know that while he was planning to remake our home in Brittany's image, I was formulating a plan of my own. Because what neither of them realized was that this house they were so eagerly planning to transform, was solely in my name. I spent a full week pretending nothing had changed. I made Daniel's favorite meals, pressed his shirts the way he liked them, and smiled at his increasingly transparent excuses about working late. But at night, while he slept soundly beside me, when he was home at all, I began my research. The deed to our house was buried in a filing cabinet, in the basement tucked away in a folder marked "Important Documents." My hands trembled slightly as I pulled it out that first night, using the light from my phone to read the fading text. There it was, in black and white, my name alone on the property deed. The memory of how this came to be flooded back. 15 years ago, Daniel had his first affair, a brief indiscretion with a paralegal at his firm. I'd forgiven him then, but I wasn't naive. During the reconciliation process, I'd insisted on having the house transferred solely to my name. For tax purposes, I'd said. Daniel had agreed readily, perhaps thinking it proved his remorse, his commitment to rebuilding our marriage. Now, standing in our basement at midnight, that old document felt like a seed of hope in my hands. For the first time since the failed vow renewal ceremony, I felt something other than pain. I felt power. The next morning, I started my day differently. Instead of rushing to make Daniel's breakfast, I took my coffee out to the garden. It was early October, and the morning air had a crisp edge to it. I sat among my roses, which were preparing for their winter sleep, and began to plan. First, I called Patricia, my closest friend and a real estate agent. "I need to know the current market value of my house," I said, emphasizing the word "my." Patricia, who had witnessed my humiliation at the chapel, understood immediately. "Marianne," she said carefully. "Are you sure about this?" "More sure than I've been about anything in years," I replied, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. While Daniel was at work, or with Brittany, I no longer cared to distinguish. I met with Patricia. She walked through each room, making notes and taking photos. Given the location and the current market, we could list it for significantly more than you might expect, she said, showing me comparable sales in the area. The number she quoted made my head spin. It was enough to secure my future, to start over completely if I chose to. But more importantly, it was enough to make sure Daniel and Brittany's carefully laid plans would crumble. That evening, as I prepared dinner, Daniel mentioned the renovations again. "I've been talking to this brilliant designer," he said, not meeting my eyes. "She has some wonderful ideas for modernizing the space." "Oh." I kept my voice light, interested. "Tell me more." He grew animated then, describing Brittany's vision for our home without ever mentioning her name. New hardwood floors throughout, knocking down walls to create an open-concept living space, a complete kitchen remodel with state-of-the-art appliances. "It sounds expensive," I said mildly, placing his plate in front of him. "Don't worry about the cost," he replied dismissively. "I've been saving for this." I thought about the joint account I checked that morning, the one where we'd been saving for our retirement. Half of those savings had disappeared over the past 6 months. Now I knew where they'd gone, into planning his new life with her. Later that night, I sat at my vanity. Looking at my reflection in the mirror, I saw something different in my eyes now. A spark of determination, a glint of strategic thinking I hadn't known I possessed. I watched as I removed my wedding ring, placing it carefully in my jewelry box. It didn't feel like an ending anymore. It felt like a beginning. I opened my laptop and began typing an email to Sarah and Michael. They deserved to know the truth about their father's betrayal, about the missing savings, about what was coming next. But most importantly, they needed to know that their mother was no longer going to be a silent witness to her own erasure. I began clearing out the house methodically, one room at a time. Not obviously enough to raise suspicion, just a gentle decluttering that Daniel barely noticed. He was too preoccupied with his phone, constantly texting Brittany about their renovation plans, to see me slowly reclaiming our space. It was during this careful excavation of our shared life that I found the letter. It was tucked inside an old copy of Jane Eyre that had belonged to Daniel's mother, Eleanor. The book had sat on our shelves for years, untouched since her passing, a decade ago. The envelope was yellowed with age, my name written in Eleanor's elegant handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it, settling into the window seat where I'd spent countless Sunday afternoons, reading while Daniel watched football. The letter was dated just 2 months before Eleanor's death. "My dear Marianne, if you're reading this, I'm no longer here, and you've finally found what I couldn't bring myself to give you in person. I've carried this burden for years, watching you pour yourself into my son's life, trying to fill a vessel that was designed to leak. Daniel has always been my greatest joy and my deepest sorrow. Even as a child, he had this way of taking attention, taking praise, taking love, without ever quite learning how to give it back. His father and I spoiled him. I see that now. We taught him that his needs were paramount, that his desires were achievements in themselves. I've watched you disappear, piece by piece over the years. I see how you dim your own light to make his shine brighter, how you swallow your words to make space for his, how you've learned to mistake his absence for independence and his neglect for trust. I remember the young woman you were when you first came into our lives. Bright, ambitious, full of dreams that had nothing to do with being someone's wife. That woman is still inside you, Marianne. She's waiting. If you're reading this, it means you've begun to question. Perhaps you've discovered one of his betrayals. He's his father's son in that way, though it breaks my heart to admit it. Or perhaps you've simply grown tired of living in the carefully crafted shadow he's built around you. I want you to know this. You don't owe him your light. You don't owe him your dreams. And you certainly don't owe him your silence. I should have told you this years ago, but guilt and maternal love kept me quiet. I watched you become the wife. I never had the courage to stop being. But you, my dear, are stronger than I ever was. When, not if, but when, you realize you're disappearing. Choose yourself, even if it's decades from now, even if everyone else tells you it's too late. It's never too late to become who you were meant to be. With love and hope for your liberation, Eleanor. I read the letter 3 times, each reading bringing fresh tears and fresh understanding. Eleanor had seen it all, had recognized in her son the same patterns that had shaped her own life. She'd given me absolution before I even knew I needed it. All these years, I'd carried the weight of our failing marriage on my shoulders. If only I were more attentive, more interesting, more beautiful, more young. But Eleanor's words stripped away those illusions. This wasn't about my inadequacies. It was about Daniel's inability to truly love anyone more than himself. I carefully folded the letter and placed it in my purse, next to the USB drive containing copies of all our financial records. Its presence felt like a talisman, a reminder that I wasn't crazy, wasn't overreacting, wasn't throwing away 40 years of marriage on a whim. That night, I slept in the guest room for the first time. Daniel didn't even notice. He was working late again, presumably finalizing more renovation plans with Brittany. But this time, his absence didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like space to breathe, to think, to remember who I was before I became Mrs. Daniel Harrison. Eleanor's words echoed in my mind as I drifted off to sleep. It's never too late to become who you were meant to be. For the first time in 40 years, I was beginning to believe that might be true. The day I discovered what Daniel had done with our children's savings started like any other. I was organizing the home office, systematically scanning documents before shredding them. Another step in my quiet preparation. That's when I found the loan paperwork, hastily stuffed into a folder marked Miscellaneous Expenses. My hands grew cold as I read through the documents. Daniel had taken out a substantial loan, using our children's trust funds as collateral. Funds we'd built carefully, over decades, meant for their futures. The money had been funneled into a separate account, one I'd never known existed, labeled Home Improvement Project. I felt physically ill. This wasn't just about betraying me anymore. This was about our children, Sarah, who was saving for her own private therapy practice, and Michael, who dreamed of opening a small bookstore. Their father had gambled their futures on his new beginning with Brittany. With trembling fingers, I called our family accountant, Tom, who'd handled our finances for 20 years. I need to understand exactly what's happening with our accounts, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. All of them. There was a long pause on the other end. Marianne, Tom said carefully, I assumed you knew. Daniel said you'd agreed to all of this. Of course he had. Daniel was always so convincing, so skilled at presenting his unilateral decisions as mutual agreements. I'd witnessed him do it in court countless times. Now I was just another witness to his persuasive performance. Tom walked me through everything. The systematic withdrawal of funds, the new account openings, the elaborate web of financial decisions that had been made without my knowledge. The renovation budget had ballooned to an astronomical sum. Enough to completely gut and rebuild our home according to Brittany's vision. "I should have questioned it more," Tom said, regret heavy in his voice. "I'm so sorry, Marianne." After hanging up, I sat in Daniel's leather office chair, surrounded by the evidence of his betrayal. Through the window, I could see Brittany's car pulling up to our house, the third time this week. She carried a large portfolio of design, plans under her arm, her heels clicking confidently up our walkway. I didn't hide. Instead, I walked downstairs and opened the door before she could ring the bell. The look of surprise on her face was almost comical. "Oh, Mrs. Harrison," she stuttered, clearly thrown off guard. "I was just here to discuss the renovation plans." I smiled, channeling 40 years of practice at being the perfect hostess. "Please, come in. I'd love to see what you have in mind for my home." She followed me to the kitchen, her confidence visibly shaken. I prepared coffee, serving hers black with 2 sugars, just as I'd observed from the cups she'd left behind. "During previous visits, Daniel mentioned you have quite an eye for design," I said, watching her spread out her plans on my kitchen island, the same island she'd marked for demolition in her sketches. "He's been very supportive of my vision," she replied, regaining some of her poise. "We think this space has so much potential." I looked at her elaborate plans, the carefully rendered drawings of a home I wouldn't recognize. Modern, sleek, expensive. Every trace of my life here would be erased, replaced by chrome and glass and clean lines. The budget must be considerable, I mused, sipping my coffee. "Daniel says money isn't an issue," she said, a hint of pride in her voice. "He wants everything to be perfect." Perfect? Of course he did. Perfect for their new life together, built on the foundation of my children's stolen futures. How wonderful that he's so generous with other people's money, I said softly, more to myself than to her. She looked up sharply, but I was already standing, gathering her papers with careful hands. "Thank you for sharing these with me, Brittany. I'm sure you and Daniel have much to discuss." As I watched her leave, confusion evident in every step, I felt an odd sense of calm. The magnitude of Daniel's betrayal should have devastated me. Instead, it crystallized something in my soul. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about protecting what belonged to our children, about finally standing up to the man who thought he could rewrite our lives without consequences. I picked up my phone and called Sarah. "Honey," I said when she answered, "I need you and Michael to come over this weekend. There's something you both need to know about your father." Sarah and Michael arrived on Saturday morning, both looking worried. I'd never called a family meeting without their father present before. We gathered in the living room, the same room where we'd opened Christmas presents for decades, where we'd celebrated birthdays and graduations, where we'd built a lifetime of memories that Brittany's renovation plans would soon erase. I'd prepared everything methodically. The financial documents spread out on the coffee table, Eleanor's letter tucked safely in my pocket, and 3 cups of coffee growing cold as I explained what their father had done. "He what?" Michael's voice cracked, his hands gripping the armrest of the sofa. "At 35, my son had always been the peacekeeper in the family, the one who tried to see the best in everyone. But now, I watched that optimism crack and splinter in real time. Sarah, ever the pragmatist like her mother, was already scanning through the loan documents. "This is illegal," she said flatly, her therapist's composure slipping. "He had no right to use our trust funds as collateral without our knowledge." I watched my children's faces as the truth sank in, not just about the money, but about the man they'd called father, The renovation plans lay spread out beside the financial documents, a glossy testament to their father's betrayal. The bookstore, Michael said quietly, his dream of opening an independent bookshop suddenly seeming further away. All my savings. And my practice, Sarah added, her voice hollow. She'd been saving to open her own therapy office, to break away from the group practice that wasn't fulfilling her vision. Listen to me, both of you, I said, leaning forward. We're going to fix this. I have a plan. I told them everything. About the house being in my name. About Brittany's frequent visits. About my quiet gatherings of evidence. As I spoke, I saw something shift in their expressions. The shock and hurt began to transform into something else. Determination. Mom, Sarah said, reaching for my hand. Why didn't you tell us sooner about Dad and her? I squeezed her hand. Because I needed to be sure of what I was doing first. I needed to protect you both. Protect us? Michael stood up, pacing the room. Mom, we're adults. We should have been protecting you. I smiled, feeling a surge of love for my children, who were ready to fight my battles. The best way you can help me now is by trusting me. I'm not the same woman who stood alone in that chapel. I'm not broken, and I'm not defeated. I pulled out Eleanor's letter then, sharing it with them for the first time. As they read their grandmother's words, I saw tears in their eyes, not just for me, but for the grandmother who had seen this coming, who had tried to leave me a lifeline. Dad always said Grandma Eleanor was too critical of him, Sarah said, wiping her eyes. Now I understand why. What do you need us to do? Michael asked, his voice firm. For now, nothing. Let your father think everything is normal. Let him believe his plans are proceeding exactly as he wants them to. I've already spoken with a lawyer, Patricia's sister Claire, about both the house and the trust funds. She's helping me build a case. Does he have any idea? Sarah asked, a hint of her father's strategic mind showing through. I thought about Daniel's continuing obliviousness, about how he still came home late, smelling of unfamiliar perfume, about how he barely noticed the subtle changes I'd been making to the house. Your father sees what he expects to see, I replied. Right now, he expects to see a compliant wife who will step aside gracefully when the time comes. He expects me to be devastated, powerless, resigned to my fate. He expects me to be who I've always been. But you're not that person anymore, are you? Michael said softly. I touched Eleanor's letter, thinking of her words about becoming who I was meant to be. No, I said, I'm not. And I'm done being invisible in my own life. As my children left that evening, they hugged me tighter than usual. Their anger at their father was palpable, but so was their pride in me. For the first time, they were seeing their mother not just as someone who needed protection, but as someone capable of protecting herself and them. That night, I added their trust fund documents to my growing file of evidence. In the quiet of my study, I wrote detailed emails to both Claire and Tom, setting the next phase of my plan in motion. Outside, I could hear Daniel's car pulling into the driveway, returning late from another business meeting with Brittany. Let him come home to his usual quiet house, his usual invisible wife. Let him believe nothing had changed. The time for visibility was coming, but not quite yet. The demolition began on a Tuesday. I stood in the driveway, watching as workers carried out pieces of my life. The handcrafted kitchen cabinets, where I'd stored 40 years of family meals. The vintage wallpaper I'd carefully selected 2 decades ago. The crown molding that had framed our family portraits. Brittany supervised everything with the confidence of someone who believed she was building her future. She'd wave to me occasionally, her smile a mixture of triumph and awkward politeness. I smiled back, playing my role perfectly. "Mrs. Harrison," she called out one morning, "we're thinking of keeping the bay window in the living room. Daniel mentioned it's your favorite spot." How generous of them, I thought, to let me keep one small corner of my own home. "That's thoughtful of you," I replied, maintaining my serene expression. "Though I suppose it won't be my spot for much longer, will it?" I watched her composure falter slightly before she turned back to the contractors. She'd been doing that more often lately, making small concessions, trying to appear considerate. Perhaps my quiet acceptance made her uncomfortable. Perhaps she was trying to ease her conscience. Daniel, meanwhile, had become increasingly absent. He'd come home late, survey the day's progress, and retreat to his study. Sometimes I'd hear him on the phone with Brittany, discussing paint colors and light fixtures, as if I weren't just down the hall. As if this house hadn't been my heart's work for 4 decades. But I kept busy with my own preparations. I'd been meeting regularly with Claire, my lawyer, documenting everything. Each unauthorized withdrawal from the children's accounts, each renovation expense, each piece of evidence showing that Daniel had systematically planned this transition without my knowledge or consent. "You're handling this remarkably well," Claire said during one of our meetings, her office a safe haven where I could speak freely. "I learned from the best," I replied, thinking of Eleanor's letter. "Daniel taught me how to play the long game without even realizing it. All those years of watching him in court, seeing how he'd let his opponents think they were winning, right until the moment he pulled the rug out from under them. One morning, as the workers were ripping out the last of my kitchen, I received an unexpected visit from Patricia. She wasn't just my real estate agent now. She'd become my closest confidant in this elaborate chess game. "I found her," Patricia said quietly as we sat in the garden, far from the construction noise. "The perfect buyer." I leaned forward, my heart beating faster. "Tell me." "Her name is Elise Matthews. Single mother, just received a substantial inheritance from her grandmother. She's been looking for a fresh start, and she's willing to pay above market value to get it quickly." I thought about this woman I'd never met, this Elise, who was unknowingly becoming a crucial piece in my careful plan. "Does she understand the situation?" Patricia nodded. I explained that the house is undergoing renovations, but that the sale would need to be completed before they're finished. She's actually excited about being able to put her own stamp on things. Later that night, I sat in my bay window, my spot, as Brittany had so generously acknowledged, and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and gold. The house was in chaos, half demolished and full of construction dust, but I felt strangely peaceful. I heard Daniel come home, heard him talking excitedly on his phone as he walked up the driveway. "The kitchen cabinets are all gone," he was saying to Brittany. "We can start with the new installation next week." I smiled to myself, thinking of Elise Matthews and her inheritance, of Claire and her carefully prepared documents, of my children and their stolen dreams that would soon be restored. Let Daniel and Brittany plan their perfect kitchen. Let them choose their expensive appliances and designer tiles. Let them believe they were building their future on the foundation of my past. They had no idea that with each wall they tore down, with each fixture they replaced, they were only making it easier for me to let go. They thought they were erasing me, but they were actually setting me free. I picked up my phone and texted Patricia. "Set up the meeting with Elise. It's time." As I pressed send, I heard the distinct sound of my favorite magnolia tree being cut down in the backyard. Another casualty of Brittany's vision for a modern landscape. I didn't flinch. That tree had witnessed 20 springs in my garden, but its roots had grown too deep, too wild. Sometimes I realized you have to let beautiful things fall to make space for something new to grow. I met Elise Matthews at a small cafe 3 towns over, far from any chance of running into Daniel. For Brittany, she arrived exactly on time, clutching a leather portfolio and wearing a simple navy dress that reminded me of something I might have worn at her age. She couldn't have been more than 35. "Mrs. Harrison," she said, extending her hand. Her handshake was firm, direct. "Thank you for meeting me like this." Patricia had chosen well. There was something in Elise's eyes that I recognized. A quiet determination, the look of someone who had learned to rebuild herself from scratch. As we ordered coffee, she pulled out photos of her daughter, Emma, a bright-eyed 7-year-old with unruly curls. Emma's father left when she was 2. Elise explained, stirring her coffee. He decided family life wasn't for him. It was challenging for a while. But then my grandmother passed away last month, leaving me her estate. She always said every woman should have a house of her own. I thought of Eleanor's letter, safely tucked in my purse. Some women, it seemed, understood the importance of leaving lifelines for others. "Tell me," I said, "what drew you to this house?" Elise's eyes lit up. The bones of it. Even with all the construction, I can see what it once was. And what it could be again. Not like this modern renovation they're doing now, but something warmer. A real home. She paused, looking embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I know they're turning it into something very different right now." "Don't apologize," I said softly. "I prefer your vision to theirs." We spent the next hour going over the details. The price was more than fair. Enough to secure my future and help my children reclaim theirs. Elise had already been approved for financing, and her lawyer had reviewed all the paperwork Claire had prepared. "There's one unusual condition," I said, watching her carefully. "The sale needs to happen quickly, and without my husband's knowledge. My lawyer has assured me this is completely legal, as the house is solely in my name." I expected questions, perhaps even judgment. Instead, Elise nodded with understanding. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "the cleanest breaks are the ones that come without warning." As we finished our coffee, Elise shared her plans for the house. Not grand designs, like Brittany's, but small, thoughtful changes. She wanted to turn the formal dining room into a library for Emma, to plant a vegetable garden in the backyard, to fill the space with books and music and laughter. "What about you?" she asked suddenly. "What will you do after?" It was the first time anyone had asked me that question. Not about the logistics or the legalities, but about my future. My real future, beyond Daniel and this elaborate plan. "I found a small apartment overlooking the river," I said, surprising myself with the warmth in my voice. "It has a tiny balcony where I can grow herbs and watch the sunrise, and it's close to the community college where I've enrolled in their creative writing program." Elise's smile was genuine. "You're going back to school?" "I am." I touched Eleanor's letter in my purse. "It's something I wanted to do 40 years ago, before I chose a different path. But it's never too late to become who you were meant to be." As we parted, Elise hugged me impulsively. "Thank you," she whispered, "for trusting me with your home." "Thank you," I replied, "for giving it a future I can believe in." Driving home, I passed the construction trucks parked in my driveway, saw Brittany's car next to Daniel's in the garage. They were probably inside, planning their future in my present. But for the first time, the sight didn't hurt. I thought of Elise and Emma, of the library they would build, of the garden they would plant, where my magnolia once stood. I thought of my own small balcony waiting for me, of the sunrise I would watch alone, of the stories I would finally write. Daniel and Brittany thought they were erasing my history, but they were only clearing the way for someone else's future, and unknowingly, for mine. In trying to remake my home in their image, they had given me the perfect opportunity to slip away and build something entirely my own. That evening, I signed the preliminary paperwork Claire had prepared. In 2 weeks, once the renovation reached a certain point, everything would be ready. The timing had to be perfect, like a well-orchestrated symphony reaching its crescendo. I went to bed that night listening to the unfamiliar echoes in my half-demolished home. But my dreams were filled with the sound of river water and the scratch of pen on paper as I wrote my own story. Finally, in my own words, the renovation had reached its peak when I received the text from Claire. "Papers are ready. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. I was in the makeshift kitchen we'd been using, preparing Daniel's favorite pasta dish, a final act in my long-running performance. The house was barely recognizable now. Brittany's vision had transformed it into a showcase of modern design, sleek surfaces, minimalist fixtures, stark white walls. The warm, lived-in home I'd cultivated for 40 years had been stripped away, replaced by something that looked like it belonged in an architectural magazine. "It's really coming together," Daniel said that evening, looking around with pride as he ate. He'd been home for dinner more often lately, excited by the progress. "Brittany has such an eye for detail." "She certainly does," I agreed, watching him twirl pasta around his fork. "Everything's exactly as she wanted it." He missed my emphasis on she, just as he'd missed so many things over the years. But tonight, his obliviousness didn't sting. Instead, it felt like a gift. One last confirmation that I was doing the right thing. After dinner, I went upstairs to the guest room where I'd been sleeping. I told Daniel it was because of the construction dust in our bedroom, and he'd accepted the excuse without question. Opening my closet, I looked at the 3 suitcases I'd packed gradually over the past weeks. They contained only what was truly mine, truly essential. Family photos, personal documents, the clothes I'd bought with my own money, my grandmother's jewelry. My phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "Everything set up at the new apartment. Mom, Michael and I stocked the fridge and set up your writing desk by the window, just like you wanted." I smiled, thinking of my children secretly preparing my new home while their father remained blind to our coordinated efforts. They'd been incredible these past few weeks, angry at their father's betrayal, but channeling that anger into helping me prepare for my fresh start. Another text came through, this one from Patricia. "Elise signed the final paperwork today. She's ready whenever you are." I sat down at the small desk in the guest room and opened my laptop. The document I'd been working on was simple but comprehensive. A letter explaining everything to Daniel. Not for his sake, he didn't deserve that consideration, but for my own closure. I needed him to understand exactly what he'd lost and why. I wrote about Eleanor's letter, about the children's trust funds, about the decades of silent sacrifices. I wrote about Brittany and the renovation, about how they'd inadvertently given me the perfect opportunity to start over. Most importantly, I wrote about myself, the woman I'd been before him, the woman I'd buried under 40 years of marriage, and the woman I was becoming now. As I typed, I could hear Daniel on the phone downstairs, probably talking to Brittany about tomorrow's scheduled deliveries, expensive appliances and custom furniture that would never be installed. The irony almost made me laugh. I finished the letter and printed 3 copies. One for Daniel, one for my lawyer, and one for myself. Then I made one final call to Claire. "Everything's ready for tomorrow," she confirmed. "The money will be transferred to the new accounts as soon as the papers are signed. Daniel won't be able to touch any of it. And the children's funds, we've already filed the paperwork to freeze those accounts. He won't be able to access them anymore. We can begin the process of recovering what he took as soon as you're ready to move forward." I thanked her and ended the call, then walked to the window. The street was quiet, peaceful. Tomorrow it wouldn't be. Tomorrow everything would change. In the bathroom, I took out my contact lenses and placed them in their case. The last time I'd performed this ritual in this house, my reflection in the mirror looked different somehow. Clearer, stronger. The woman looking back at me wasn't the same one who'd stood alone in that chapel 2 months ago. I got into bed and turned out the light, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of my almost foreign home. In less than 12 hours, Daniel would discover that his perfect renovation was actually my perfect escape. That while he'd been busy erasing my past, I'd been quietly building my future. My last thought before drifting off to sleep was of my new apartment's balcony and the sunrise I would watch tomorrow, the first morning of my new life. The herbs I'd ordered were being delivered next week. Basil, thyme, lavender. Plants that would thrive in small spaces, proving that you didn't need grand gardens to grow something beautiful. The morning everything changed, I woke before sunrise. I'd already moved most of my essential belongings to the new apartment, but I took extra care with my appearance that day. Choosing a cream-colored silk blouse I'd bought for myself last month, pearl earrings that had been my mother's, and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly what's about to happen. Daniel was still asleep when I left, heading supposedly to my weekly coffee meetup with Patricia. He didn't stir when I closed the door. Didn't notice that I'd taken my house keys off the keyring we'd shared for 40 years. He'd grown so accustomed to my invisibility that he'd forgotten to really see me. Claire's office was warm and welcoming when I arrived at 9:45 a.m. Sarah and Michael were already there, both having taken the morning off work to be present for this moment. My children hugged me tightly, their presence a reminder of everything I was fighting for. "Are you ready?" Claire asked, spreading the papers across her mahogany desk. I nodded, taking my seat. The documents were comprehensive. The sale of the house to Elise Matthews, the freezing of the children's trust accounts, the detailed evidence of Daniel's financial misconduct, and my petition for divorce. As I signed each paper, I thought about the parallel universe happening at my soon-to-be former home. Brittany would be arriving around now with her team of designers, ready for another day of transformation. Daniel would be heading to his office, confident in his carefully constructed plan. Neither of them knew that their renovation dreams were about to collapse like a house of cards. "Done," Claire said, gathering the signed papers. "The house is officially sold. The funds have been transferred to your new account, and the children's accounts are protected. Shall we make the calls?" I looked at my children, saw the mixture of sadness and determination in their eyes. This wasn't just my moment of liberation. It was their moment of justice, too. Sarah squeezed my hand as I picked up my phone. I'd written a script for this moment, but as I dialed Daniel's number, I realized I didn't need it. 40 years of silence had given way to perfect clarity. He answered on the third ring. "Marianne, I'm heading into a meeting." "No, Daniel, you're going to listen." My voice was steady, almost gentle. "The renovation needs to stop immediately. The house has been sold." There was a long pause, then a laugh that didn't quite mask his confusion. "What are you talking about? The house isn't for sale." "The house was in my name, Daniel. You knew that." It was my one condition after your first affair, remember? And, as of 10 minutes ago, it belongs to someone else." The silence on the other end was deafening. I could almost see him processing this information, his lawyer's mind racing to find a loophole, an explanation, a way out. "You can't do this," he finally said, his voice rising. "Everything we've invested in the renovation." "You mean everything? You invested from our children's trust funds?" I interrupted quietly. "Yes, we know about that too. The accounts have been frozen, and Claire has already filed the paperwork to recover the funds you misappropriated." "Claire? Who's Claire?" "My lawyer, Patricia's sister. She's very good at what she does. You taught me that, Daniel. The importance of having excellent legal representation." I heard him inhale sharply, heard papers rustling as he presumably reached for documents that would no longer help him. "Where are you?" "Where I needed to be 40 years ago, taking care of myself. The new owner takes possession immediately. You have until 5 p.m. to remove your personal belongings. Anything left behind will be donated to charity." "And Brittany's renovation plans?" The fact that this was his concern, not our marriage, not our children's money, but Brittany's plans, confirmed everything. "I suggest you tell her to stop the workers right now. Any changes made to the house from this point forward would be vandalism of someone else's property." As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. "Elise's lawyer just served the work crew with a cease and desist order. You should see Brittany's face." "You've been planning this," Daniel said, realization finally dawning. "All this time while we were renovating?" "Yes," I replied simply. "I learned from watching you, Daniel. How to smile while making other plans. How to let someone think they're winning, right until the moment they lose everything. Consider it your last lesson to me." I ended the call before he could respond. My hands weren't shaking, my heart wasn't racing. Instead, I felt the kind of peace that comes from finally speaking your truth after a lifetime of silence. Sarah and Michael hugged me again, their own phones already buzzing with missed calls from their father. But they stayed right where they were, with me, in this moment of transformation. "What now?" Michael asked softly. I looked at my watch. It was 10:30 a.m. "Now," I said, standing up. "We go to my new apartment. I have a sunrise to catch tomorrow morning, and I need to make sure my writing desk is in just the right spot." The calls started coming in around noon. First from Daniel's partners at the law firm, then from his sister, and finally from Brittany herself. I let them all go to voicemail, each message more desperate than the last. My phone buzzed continuously as I unpacked boxes in my new apartment, but I felt no urge to answer. 40 years of always being available had ended with my signature on those papers. Sarah and Michael helped me arrange my new space, a sun-filled 2-bedroom apartment that felt more like me than our house had in years. The living room windows faced east, promising those sunrises I'd been dreaming of, and the small balcony already held the herb planters my children had bought as a housewarming gift. "Dad's trying to get an emergency injunction," Sarah reported, checking her messages. She'd been getting updates from her friend who worked at the courthouse. "Claire says it's pointless. The sale is completely legal, and all the paperwork is ironclad." I was hanging my favorite painting, a watercolor of a woman reading by a window that I'd bought for myself last month, when Brittany's voice message came through. I played it on speaker, curious to hear what she'd say. "Mrs. Harrison," her voice wavered between anger and disbelief. "You can't do this to us. We've invested so much in the renovation. Daniel says you're being unreasonable, that we can work something out. Please call us back." Michael snorted as he unpacked my books. Work something out? Like they worked out their plans behind your back? I placed the last book on the shelf. A new copy of Jane Eyre, different from the one that had held Eleanor's letter. They still don't understand, I said, stepping back to admire the small library we'd created. They think this is a negotiation. Around 3 o'clock, Patricia called with an update from the house. Daniel showed up with his lawyer, demanding to stop the moving crew Elise sent, she reported. But Elise's people had the sale documentation and police backup. You should have seen his face when they started carrying out his things. I could picture it. Daniel, who had orchestrated so many legal victories, finally facing an opponent he hadn't seen coming. And Brittany? Left in tears about an hour ago. All her design plans are sitting in a pile on the front lawn. Elise's daughter is already planning which room will be her library. I smiled, thinking of young Emma and her books. Some endings were also perfect beginnings. The sun was setting when Claire called with news about the trust funds. We've traced most of the money Daniel diverted, she said. He tried to hide it through a series of transfers, but he got sloppy. Too confident that no one was watching. That's Daniel, I replied, watering my new herbs. He never thought I'd look too closely at anything he did. As evening fell, I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine, watching the city lights come alive. Sarah had gone to pick up dinner, and Michael was on the phone with his girlfriend, explaining why he needed to postpone their plans for the night. My children's protectiveness warmed my heart, but I knew they didn't need to worry anymore. Text from Daniel arrived. We need to talk, face to face. You owe me that much. I stared at those words, you owe me, and felt the last thread of our shared history snap. After 40 years of marriage, he still thought in terms of debts and obligations. He still didn't understand that the moment he'd betrayed not just me, but our children, he'd lost the right to demand anything. I typed a simple reply. No, Daniel. I don't owe you anything anymore. Then I blocked his number. Sarah returned with Chinese food. Not from the fancy place Daniel preferred, but from the small family-owned restaurant I'd always loved. We ate directly from the containers, sitting on unpacked boxes and laughing about the fortune cookies predictions. To new beginnings, my fortune read, looking around my new home, at my children's happy faces, at the small but perfect space that was entirely mine. I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, anticipation. Not for a future shaped by someone else's desires, but for one I would craft myself. The construction sounds from my old house were replaced by the gentle hum of city traffic and the distant whistle of trains. Tomorrow I would wake up to my first sunrise here. Tomorrow I would sit at my writing desk and begin putting my story into words. Tomorrow belonged to me. My phone buzzed one last time. A message from Elise. Emma's already planning her library. Thank you for trusting us with your home. We'll fill it with new stories. New stories. That's what we were all writing now. Elise and Emma in their library-to-be, my children reclaiming their stolen futures, and me finally becoming the author of my own life. I woke before dawn on my first morning in the new apartment, drawn to the large windows that had attracted me to this space. The city was still sleeping, its usual bustle replaced by a peaceful quiet that felt almost sacred as I made my coffee, just for myself, just the way I liked it. I thought about how strange it was to move forward by starting small. The sunrise painted the sky in shades I'd forgotten existed. Standing on my balcony, watching light spill over the river, I remembered Eleanor's words about becoming who I was meant to be. The morning air carried the scent of possibility and the gentle promise of my newly planted herbs. My writing desk faced the window. a deliberate choice. No more hiding in corners, no more making myself small. The notebook Sarah had given me lay open, its pages blank but full of potential. I sat down and began to write, not about Danielle or Brittany or the life I'd left behind, but about the woman who was emerging from the shadows of that existence. Around mid-morning, there was a knock at my door. My new neighbor, a silver-haired woman named Dolores, stood there with a potted lavender plant. "Welcome to the building," she said warmly. "I thought your balcony garden might like a new friend." We shared coffee at my small kitchen table, and I learned that Dolores had her own story of transformation. 20 years ago, she'd left a toxic marriage and rebuilt her life, piece by piece. "The first morning is the hardest," she said, understanding in her eyes. "But it gets easier. Then it gets wonderful." Later, I walked to the local bookstore. Not the sterile chain store Daniel preferred, but a cozy independent shop with worn wooden floors and a resident cat. I bought books I'd always wanted to read but had set aside for Daniel's preferred, legal thrillers. The owner, a gentleman named Marcus, recommended poetry collections and memoirs written by women who had reinvented themselves. Back home, I arranged my new books on the shelf, their spines forming a rainbow of possibilities. My phone remained blessedly silent, Claire's legal maneuvering, and my blocked numbers creating a fortress of peace around my new life. In the evening, I took my first writing class at the community college. The classroom was full of people, with stories to tell, dreams they'd put on hold, voices they were ready to reclaim. The instructor, a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, gave us our first assignment. Write about a moment when you chose yourself. I smiled, thinking of all the moments that had led to this one. The chapel where I'd stood alone, the letter that had given me permission to break free, the morning I'd signed those papers in Claire's office, the sunrise I'd watched today. As night fell over the city, I sat on my balcony again, Dolores's lavender plant adding its subtle fragrance to the evening air. From somewhere nearby, I heard music playing, a woman's voice singing about freedom and rebirth. It felt like a serenade for my new beginning, a lullaby for the woman I was becoming. 6 months after I left my old life behind, I received an unexpected invitation. Elise wanted me to visit my former home, to see what she and Emma had created in the space Brittany had once planned to claim. I hesitated at first, unsure if I was ready to face those memories. But something in Elise's message gave me courage. "Emma's library is complete, and there's a story we'd like to share with you." I chose a bright autumn morning for the visit, when the air was crisp and clear. Dolores, who had become both friend and mentor these past months, walked with me to the corner where Patricia waited in her car. Together, they formed the kind of support system I'd never known I needed. Women who understood that strength often comes in whispers, rather than shouts. The house looked different, but not in the way Brittany had envisioned. Where she had planned stark minimalism, Elise had created warmth. The formal dining room where I'd served countless silent dinners was now Emma's library, its walls lined with books and comfortable reading nooks. My old garden had been replanted with vegetables and wildflowers, a cheerful chaos that felt more alive than my careful landscaping ever had. "Mom." Emma came running, clutching a book to her chest. "I wrote my first story, and it's about you." Elise smiled apologetically. "She found out you were taking writing classes, and it inspired her. She insisted on writing about the lady who gave us our home." Emma's story, written in careful second-grade handwriting, was titled The Quiet Queen. It was about a woman who lived in a crystal palace with a man who couldn't see her magic. One day she discovered she could turn invisible at will, and used her power to escape and build a kingdom of her own. As I read, I thought about Eleanor's letter, safely framed now on my writing desk. About how wisdom passes between women like a secret handshake, a quiet revolution of understanding and strength. About how my story had already inspired another generation to understand their own power. "I have something for you too," Elise said, leading me to the bay window, my old spot now transformed into a reading corner. There, in a place of honor, sat a small plaque. "Every woman deserves a home of her own, in honor of Eleanor and Marianne." That evening, back in my apartment, I finished the final chapter of my own story. Not the one about Daniel's betrayal or Brittany's renovation, but the one about a woman who learned that love shouldn't require invisibility, that power can be found in silence, and that it's never too late to choose yourself. I walked out onto my balcony, where my herbs had grown, abundant and wild. The sunset painted the sky in colors that reminded me of dawn, an ending that felt like a beginning. Below, the river flowed steadily onward, carrying yesterday's stories toward tomorrow's possibilities. In the distance, a chapel bell rang, and I smiled at the symmetry. 6 months ago, I had stood in a different chapel, watching my old life crumble. Now, I stood in my own space, surrounded by the life I had built for myself, word by word, choice by choice, sunrise by sunrise. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer silent. I was finally, completely free. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Give it a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video. I stood there in my cream-colored dress, surrounded by flickering candles and the expectant faces of our